Okay. Thank you everybody for coming. I want to welcome you to today's program. My name is Melanie McKenzie. I'm the Access and Technology Services Librarian at the Eastham Public Library. Again, I want to thank you for coming to this virtual program. At the Eastham Library, we've been serving the public since 1897, and we are committed to continuing to serve the public through the current public health crisis. If you have not done so already, I encourage you to go to the library's website at easthamlibrary.org to register for our e-newsletter, Wowbrary. That's the best way to keep up to date on all the current virtual programming offerings by the library, as well as new materials that the library is adding into their collection. All right, so today we are pleased to offer you a virtual Black Heritage Trail tour with National Park Service Ranger Amelia Benstean. Amelia has a Bachelor of Arts degree from Gettysburg College in History and Spanish, and she received her master's degree in history from Simmons University. Amelia has been with the Boston African American National Historic Site for a little over 6 years now, and she is a member of the social justice team there. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Ranger Amelia Benstean. I do just want to ask a quick housekeeping item. If you could all remain muted for the duration of Amelia's presentation, please do feel free to add questions to the chat. I will be monitoring that, and we will absolutely have time to answer questions at the end of Amelia's presentation. So thank you very much, and let's go ahead and get started.
Great, thank you, Melanie. Thank you for having me. I'm gonna just go ahead and share my screen to get us started today. So as Melanie mentioned, we're going to be taking, a virtual Black Heritage Trail tour today. So normally we would be starting at the Robert Gould Shaw Memorial. We'd be outside right on the edge of Boston Common, across from the State House, so a really prominent location in the city. And we're just going to explore some of the history of 19th century Boston and focus on slavery and abolition and what it looked like at that point in our city. So all of our programs start right here at the Shaw Memorial, which was erected to commemorate the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, which is the first all-Black volunteer regiment that fights for the Union during the Civil War. Now, this regiment comes about in 1863. At the beginning of the Civil War, which we know is 1861, if you're a free Black person in the Union, you're actually not allowed to enlist in the Army. And that doesn't change until halfway through the war when Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation. So in January, when he signs that Emancipation Proclamation, it says two things. The first thing it says is that it abolishes slavery in any state that has seceded from the Union. So any of those Confederate states, it's ending slavery there. But what's important to remember is there are still slaveholding states within the Union at this point, and this is not changing the status of anyone enslaved there. The second thing it does, however, is it allows for the creation of the first all-Black volunteer regiment, the Massachusetts 54th, which is where you get the men in this monument today. So the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, they're well known for a couple of different things, and I want to just take you through those kind of accolades really quickly. So first and foremost, they're the first Black regiment to fight for the Union during the Civil War, which is a huge step forward. That's a huge amount of progress. Because they are the first, they're facing a lot of challenges. So not only is it a challenge just to get the authorization to form this regiment, but once these men enlist, they're supposed to be receiving a pay of $13 a month. And $13 a month is about what you would pay a white soldier for the Union Army at this time. However, these men, they get their first paycheck and they realize they're only being paid $10 a month. Now, $10 is what you would pay a laborer for the Union Army. That's not what you pay someone carrying a gun, putting their life on the line for their country. So collectively, these men decide to boycott their wages, and they do that for over a year and a half. And it's not until June 1864 that Congress actually authorizes a retroactive measure paying these men the $13 a month they deserve for every month they have been enlisted in the Union Army. So that's one of their first real political victories. In terms of military engagements, they are best known for their work at the Battle of Fort Wagner. Now, this is technically a loss. However, these men fight very nobly. They fight very persistently. They make some key advancements for the Union during this time. And because of how they fight, they really start to change the nation's opinion on the efficacy of Black soldiers. At this point, a lot of people within the Union don't believe that Black men can be just as good and just as brave soldiers as white men. And their work at the Battle of Fort Wagner, the courage they displayed during that battle really starts to kind of change public opinion on that. Now, the monument itself comes about because after the Civil War ends, these men want a way to commemorate and to remember those who fought for the Union and those who died. So they actually commission an artist. The man's name is Augustus St. Gaudens. He's a hugely accomplished sculptor. St. Gaudens has studied in Paris and Rome, and he's actually working in New York City at this point. So originally, when St. Gaudens is going to create this memorial, he takes the plans to Shaw's parents. That's the commander you see right here on the horse. And the plans are just Robert Gould Shaw, the commander, on his horse. It doesn't include the men. But when St. Gaudens asks Shaw's parents how they would like his son depicted, it's actually his father who says, "You must not know the true history of this regiment, because how can you represent the first all-Black volunteer regiment with my white son?" So St. Gaudens goes back to the drawing board, and on the, what's the word here? On the suggestion of Shaw's parents, he includes the men from the regiment in that memorial. And that's where you get the image in the memorial you see today. So if you take a moment to look at the faces of the men, you notice that these are really stoic faces. They're really realistic, and they're respectful depictions of Black men. And this is totally different from what you're seeing in the media and the news at this point. At this point, the media is portraying kind of cartoonish features, think things like blackface and minstrel shows, nothing that is respectful to Black men, certainly not to men who have served their country and died for their country. So St. Gaudens, he actually goes out of his way to make sure that these are respectful and accurate depictions of Black men. He hires Black men off the streets of New York City. He pays them to pose for him, and then he actually sculpts their faces. So if you were to stand before the memorial today, every face that you would see in that memorial was actually the face of a Black man who was living in New York in roughly the 1880s, 1890s. So this memorial, for that reason, is really kind of on the forefront of the depiction of Black men in art. Now, when it's dedicated, there is a massive outpouring of support. So at that time, you see 65 veterans of the original 54th marching back into Boston. This is them right here in the foreground, along Beacon Street. They're marching into the city, whereas all those years before, when they departed Boston and went down to Fort Wagner in South Carolina, they marched in the opposite direction out of the city. So they're marching past this newly unveiled memorial. And if you look really closely, you can see that there is a man in the center carrying the American flag. Now that man is actually Sergeant William Kearny. During the Battle of Fort Wagner, he notices that the American flag has started to fall. And that's because the standard bearer has been shot. So Kearny rushes up to prevent this from happening. We know that as a mark of respect, we can't let the flag touch the ground. So in trying to save the flag, Kearny is shot about 3 to 4 times in the torso. He's gravely injured. So much so that he actually has to take that flag, shove it down his shirt, and then crawl back to camp on his hands and knees. And when he finally gets back to camp, he's able to stand with the help of his men around him. And he takes that flag out of his shirt and he says, "I did my duty, boys. Old Glory never touched the ground." So for that, Sergeant Kearny is the first African-American man to be awarded the Medal of Honor by Congress, which is, of course, the highest military award we have in this country. All right, I want to pause here for a quick ask for questions. I know that was a lot of information about the 54th Regiment and the memorial today. Does anyone have a question at this point?
I'm not seeing any in the chat yet, but if somebody wants to unmute themselves, you're also welcome to speak up and ask any questions or put it in the chat, either way.
Hi, I have a question. I just want to know, did the artist consider asking any of the actual soldiers to sit for this memorial?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. A lot of the original soldiers were dead at this point. The memorial's not erected until 1897. So although these men do begin almost as soon as the Civil War ends, advocating for memorial to be put up, It does take about 30 plus years for that to actually happen. So a lot of the men are no longer living at this point. A lot of the men still are living in the New England or the Massachusetts area, so they're not necessarily living where St. Gaudens works. And then, of course, this is meant to be a memorial depicting these men in 1863 as they're marching out of Boston. So St. Gaudens at that time is really looking for men who would have been about the same age as these men were in 1863. So for that reason, he goes with just men he sees in New York who roughly fit that bill, as opposed to the original members of the 54th.
Thanks, Amelia. Any other questions right now? All right, I think we're good to keep going.
All right, so we're going to move on to what would normally be our next stop, which is the George Middleton House. So this is located right on Pinckney Street, which is kind of the dividing line of Beacon Hill. So if you kind of visualize Beacon Hill in your head for a moment, the side that faces Boston Common is the south slope of Beacon Hill. And that's always been a really wealthy, predominantly white part of the hill. Now, the other side from Pinckney Street, where this house is located, down to Cambridge Street, that's the north slope of Beacon Hill. And in the 19th century, this was home to a free Black community who lived in Boston, and that community goes on to become really the leaders of the abolitionist movement here in Boston. So George Middleton, his home is located right on the dividing line of that hill. It's also, we believe, the oldest standing wooden home in Beacon Hill. It was built in the late 18th century. A lot of what you see in Beacon Hill today is brick, and that's partially because Boston had several pretty devastating fires early on in its history. So by the time Beacon Hill is being developed in the 1800s, there is a law that states if you want to build over a certain height, you do need to build brick, just to cut down on that risk of fire. So George Middleton himself is worth talking about for a couple of different reasons. The first is that he is a member of the Prince Hall Masons. He's actually the third Grand Master. So for anyone who's ever heard of the Masons, in 1700s Boston, early 1700s, there is an existing Masonic group. And there's a free Black man named Prince Hall who wants to join that Masonic group. He applies for admission, but he's unfortunately denied based on the color of his skin. So Prince Hall says, okay, I'm going to go back to England and I'm going to ask the original division of Masons there to give me a charter to start a Masonic group for the free Black citizens of Boston. And that's exactly what he does. England has no problem giving him that charter. So he comes back here and starts the Prince Hall Masons, which are of course named for him. So George Middleton, who was a resident of this home in the late 1700s, he's actually the third leader of that particular Masonic lodge. The other thing that George Middleton does is he's the commander of the Bucks of America, which are one of two Black regiments that fight in and around Boston during the American Revolution. Now, this is really interesting because we just talked about the beginning of the Civil War and Black men not being allowed to enlist in the army, yet we see this happening with the Bucks of America as early as the American Revolution. So we see that as we're making that transition from colony to country, the Black population is playing a really active role in shaping the nation. And as we do make that transition from a colony to a country, each state writes their own constitution. So Massachusetts ratifies a constitution in 1780, primarily authored by John Adams, that includes the line, all men are born free and equal. And that's a little bit different from what you see in other state constitutions or the US Constitution at that point. And essentially this line, all men are born free and equal, it allows for a loophole, a legal loophole, where enslaved people can sue for their freedom in court and win. And the first woman who figures this out is a woman named Bett. So Bett is enslaved in Western Massachusetts to a couple named John and Hannah Ashley. She experiences a lot of cruel treatment at the hands of her enslavers. And what's really interesting about her story is that John Ashley is actually a judge in the Massachusetts Court of Common Pleas, which means that when we're going through that process as a state of debating and drafting and ratifying a constitution, he's hearing all that language surrounding it. He's coming home, he's talking about it with his wife, with his colleagues. And Bett starts to hear what he's talking about, and she starts to think, why not me? What makes me any different from any other person in this state? Why am I not legally free and equal as well? So in 1783, Mom Bett goes out. She hires a lawyer, a man named Theodore Cedric Jr. She convinces him to represent her in court, and then she takes her enslaver to court and sues for her freedom. And she wins. So Mom Bett is setting this incredible precedent as early as 1781, where she's demonstrating to Black people in her community that you can legally sue for your freedom and win. So after she gains her freedom, Mom Bett actually changes her name to Elizabeth Freeman, which is really fitting. And then she goes to work as a paid servant for the family of the lawyer who represented her. The other thing she does, though, is she continues to tell her friends about her success. So she's starting this really great domino effect. And in the early 1780s in Massachusetts, we see more and more individuals taking their enslavers to court and winning. So much so that by the time 1783 rolls around, Massachusetts realizes they need one consistent ruling. They can no longer legislate each case on an individual basis. There are just too many. It's not worth it. So in 1783, Massachusetts abolishes slavery within the state. Now, they're the first state to do so, and that decision is what really then allows for this free Black community to develop on the north slope of Beacon Hill during the 19th century. Do we have any questions about how slavery was abolished in Massachusetts? Mom Bett, George Middleton.
Once again, please feel free to unmute yourself. You can go ahead and ask your question or put it in the chat, either way.
Yeah, I have a question. When the slaves were freed in Massachusetts by legislative order, were slaveholders compensated in any way?
That's a great question. To my knowledge, enslavers were not compensated when people were freed. It would have been incredibly difficult to figure out how to compensate someone. You know, how do you ever quantify the cost of a human being or the worth of a human being? But it's also important to remember that just because people are being freed, it doesn't necessarily mean that people's attitudes towards slavery are changing drastically in Massachusetts. As you said, this is a legislative decision, so it's a law. You have to obey this, but that doesn't mean that people necessarily agree with it. Now, public opinion is going to continue to shift over the next 50 or 60 years, kind of more towards that abolitionist perspective. But for a lot of people in Massachusetts, this would have been a bit of a shock, and it would have been difficult. It's also key to remember that people are not owning the large numbers of enslaved individuals in Massachusetts and New England that people are owning in the Deep South. You're not really seeing kind of the plantation style slavery in Massachusetts. You're seeing families or individuals owning one or two people who are helping out on much smaller, more modest farms or in the house. So when you think about what the compensation would have needed to be and how deeply it would have impacted people, it's having a smaller impact on people in Massachusetts than it would be having in, say, like a Georgia or South Carolina at that point.
Thank you.
I have a question. I live in Brewster, and we have records in our Brewster Historical Society of exactly what you're saying, and the state is read before a judge, and there were slaves declared as property, and the transfer of ownership was so articulated in the language. The second aspect of slavery, particularly on Cape Cod in the 1800s, the Cape was renowned for its ship industry, not just whaling, but maybe even going to Africa to pick up slaves to bring them back to the south or the north. And I guess that's my general question is, what evidence or understanding do you have of Massachusetts' role in actually in the slave trade?
This is actually an incredibly timely question. We have been doing a ton of primary source research trying to figure out really what the extent of Boston and Massachusetts' role in the transatlantic slave trade was. A lot of that has stemmed from calls in recent years to rename Faneuil Hall, because Peter Faneuil did, of course, own enslaved individuals. So what we've learned is that Massachusetts, we begin to have slavery here in 1638. That's when the first slave ship, the Desire, arrives in Boston Harbor with its human cargo. So we have a long legacy of enslavement in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is also huge in terms of the shipbuilding industry. So a lot of those ships that are going down to the Caribbean or that are then heading over to Africa, a lot of those ships are in fact being built in Massachusetts and New England as a whole. Bristol, Rhode Island is a huge kind of hub of importing enslaved Africans to the colonies. Boston, people are also coming into, but you see people coming into Boston in smaller numbers. I think one of the important things to realize is that of the people taken from Africa, over 90% of those people are going to the Caribbean and to South America. There's only about 5 to 10% that are actually arriving in the American colonies. So it's a relatively small number in comparison to that 12.5 million that are actually being taken forcibly from Africa. That being said, most of Boston's economy is dependent in some way upon slavery in the 17 and 1800s. I think a really great example of this is on the south slope of Beacon Hill. You had a lot of the cotton giants living. So people who own the Lowell mills, like the Lawrences, the Appletons, the Lowells, they all live on the south slope of Beacon Hill. Now, they, of course, support enslavement because that's how they're keeping their profits high, but they're getting their cotton from the South, and that cotton is picked and produced by enslaved labor. It's a very similar setup in 18th century Boston. We're importing things like rum, molasses, sugar. Those are all coming into Boston, and in turn, we're exporting a lot of cod. Now, cod is most of what was used to feed enslaved people in the Caribbean. So while the number of enslaved people coming in and out of Boston is relatively low in comparison to what's happening in Bristol or the Caribbean, a lot of those goods that are dependent on enslaved labor and that feed enslaved labor are coming into and out of Boston.
You said the ship in 1638 was the Desire?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much, Amelia.
You're welcome.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that, Amelia?
Yeah.
So then is it safe to say that even though, Massachusetts was the first state to legislatively outlaw slavery, that they were still ultimately benefiting from it so long as the other states had slavery active? Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's a really fair statement. What we know about slavery is that its legacy is incredibly long lasting. And while you might be able to end direct enslavement of people in one place, that doesn't mean that slavery isn't still factoring into your economy, into your belief system.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah.
Any other questions now? Or are we okay to move on? All right, I think we're good.
All right, so we're going to shift and start talking about education. So this is located just down the street from the George Middleton house. This is the Phillips School. It was built in 1824. It is technically located on the north slope of Beacon Hill, so on the side of that free Black community. However, this was a school for white boys. When the Phillips School opens in 1824, it's an excellent school. You can get a really great education here. However, you can only attend if you're a white boy, which means that you would have been attending probably from the south slope of Beacon Hill. So it's really interesting to note that Pinckney Street, that street we denoted as kind of the line of demarcation for Beacon Hill, it's not absolute. It's a little wishy-washy, but take a moment to consider what it would have felt like to see such an exquisite school on your side of the hill and then not be able to attend it. At the Phillips School, you can get a great education. So think lots of resources, lots of funding, great teachers. These are often students who are going on to higher education at this time. If you're a free Black person in Boston, however, you have to attend the Abiel Smith School. So the Abiel Smith School is located a couple of blocks away. And right off the bat from the picture, you can tell that it is a significantly smaller school. The Abiel Smith School has about 75 students to one teacher. They have a white headmaster who is racist, who is cruel to the students and their parents. By contrast, they get almost no funding from the city, so they have very few resources and a really, really tiny library of books for their students. So the Abiel Smith School is not where you would choose to go to school. It's not where you're going to get the best education in Boston. But if you're a Black person living in Boston at this time, it is your only option. So when the Abiel Smith School opens in 1835, it does kind of seem like a step forwards because now we're providing a school for this chunk of the community. But at the same time, for all of those reasons we just talked about, it is by no means the school that is needed. And there's a lot of people in this community who recognize that early on, and they decide to advocate for a better school or for integrated schooling. And one of the best examples of that is a man named William Cooper Nell. So William Cooper Nell, he grows up on the north slope of Beacon Hill. He attends classes in the basement of the African Meeting House. The African Meeting House is actually located right next to the Abiel Smith School. We're gonna kind of visit it per se a little later. But William Cooper Nell's a really bright student. He actually receives the Benjamin Franklin Award as a student, which is the highest academic award given out in Boston at that time. And recipients are usually invited to Faneuil Hall for a celebratory dinner to accept that award. Now, because he's Black, he's not invited to this dinner. Instead, he's given a biography of Benjamin Franklin, and that's it. But William Cooper Nell is also a really determined young man. He decides that he deserves to be there, and he's going to find a way to make that happen. So he goes out, he finds another boy who is working at the event as a waiter. He switches uniforms with him, and he goes as a worker to the event that he should have been a guest at. And when he's there, one of the school board members recognizes him. And he says to William Cooper Nell, "You ought to be here with the other boys." Now, Nell doesn't say anything at this point. He doesn't have to. But we do know that this is a really searing and formative moment in his life. He actually, because of this moment, resolves that he is going to change the school system so that other young Black children aren't experiencing the discrimination that he experienced as they try and get an education, which means that William Cooper Nell actually leads a boycott of the Abiel Smith School for over 11 years. Now, during that time, this community is refusing to send their students to school there, which means they're either schooling them again in the basement of the African Meeting House or in small homeschool groups. At the same time as this is happening, we also have a court case called Roberts v. Boston. So Sarah Roberts, who is the who the court case is open for, is a 5-year-old Black girl who lives in Boston. And her father, Benjamin, he's determined that his daughter is going to go to a better school, which in this case means a white school. So he tries to enroll his daughter in several white schools. He's turned down. He does manage to enroll Sarah in the Otis School. He sends his daughter off to school. Things go pretty well for a couple of months. And then about partway through the school year, the school board finds out that there is a Black child attending their white school, and they send the police to come and take Sarah out of school. So think about that for a moment. The police come and pull a 5-year-old girl out of school because of the color of her skin. Think about what it would have felt like to be Sarah Roberts on that day. How terrifying, how overwhelming that would have been. Now think too, what it would have felt like to be her father. Probably incensed, frustrated, upset. So Benjamin Roberts is determined that this is not going to be the end of the story for Sarah. So he actually goes out, he hires a lawyer, a man named Robert Morris, one of the first Black lawyers in the country. Robert Morris is going to work with Charles Sumner, a white lawyer. Together, they form the first interracial legal team to try a case in a court of law. So the case is Roberts v. Boston. And what they do is they sue the city of Boston in 1849 for Sarah's right to attend one of those white schools. Now, unfortunately, the difference between 1849 and 1954 is that in 1849, the judge rules against Sarah. He says that separate is equal, and we know that, of course, separate is never equal. He actually sets the precedent that is later used in passing Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, which we know legalizes segregation on a national and a federal level. So it's a tremendous loss for this community. However, at the same time, you have William Cooper Nell leading that boycott of the Abiel Smith School. And then you also have parents leading petition drives for integration all over Boston and Massachusetts. And finally, in 1855, through the combined weight of that boycott, that court case, and the petition drive, Massachusetts is forced to listen, and they desegregate their school system. So think about that, 1855. We don't see this happening on a national or a federal level until 1954 with that landmark case, Brown v. Board of Education. So 99 years, really almost an entire century before we see this happening in the United States as a whole. It's happening right here in Massachusetts, and a lot of the drive for that change is coming from this community on the north slope of Beacon Hill. Do we have any questions about the fight for integration and equal education in Boston?
We're good. Anybody? Okay.
All right. So if we don't have any questions, we're going to shift again. We're going to head over to the Hayden House and we'll start talking a little bit more about the Underground Railroad. So the Hayden House is a couple blocks down from the Phillips School, pretty close to the Abiel Smith School. And this was where Lewis and Harriet Hayden lived. So both Lewis and Harriet were born into slavery in Kentucky. Lewis is actually married twice. The first time he's married to a woman named Esther. However, he is separated from her when she's sold to another enslaver. He never sees or hears from her again. Lewis later remarries a woman named Harriet. They have a son, Joseph. And in 1844, they decide that they've had more than enough of enslavement. They want to try their lives as free people and to try their luck on the Underground Railroad. So the Underground Railroad, we know, is of course that network of safe houses that leads out of enslavement in the South up to freedom in the North. Now, previously, historians have had a bit of a tendency to gender the Underground Railroad as male and white, and we know that this is not true. This is actually very much an interracial network that's taking the contributions of both men and women, Black and white, to operate successfully. And Lewis and Harriet Hayden are a fantastic example of this kind of partnership. So the Haydens initially escape up to Detroit into Canada, and then they feel so powerfully that they need to be a piece of that Underground Railroad and to be a part of ending slavery in this country, that they move back to Boston. And in 1850, they move into this house, 66 Phillips Street, which they operate as a safe house on the Underground Railroad. Now, the Hayden home becomes known as the safest safe house in Boston. It's referred to as the Temple of Refuge. And by really conservative estimates, we think that they harbored over 100 people in their home between 1850 and 1860. So the Hayden house is really run so successfully because you have Lewis Hayden out and about in the community, and then you have Harriet Hayden at home taking care of the freedom seekers, staying with them on a day-to-day basis. It's Harriet who's clothing them, who's feeding them, who's kind of orienting them to Boston, maybe helping them find work, while Lewis is out kind of strategizing on a larger level with other leaders from Boston's free Black community. Now, I think one of the best examples of how successful and impactful the Haydens are comes from the story of William and Ellen Craft. So William and Ellen Craft were both enslaved in Macon, Georgia. They were married. If you look at Ellen, she's on the left over here. You notice that she has really light skin. So Ellen is actually only a quarter Black. Her mother is half Black, half white, and her father is her enslaver. So think about what that means for you if your father is your enslaver. That's not a person who's ever going to claim you as their child. And think too what that means for your mother. This is likely not a decision your mother underwent willingly to have a child. What's unfortunate too is that at this time, whether you are enslaved or free is determined by your mother. And that's kind of largely because there is a long legacy of enslavers, white male enslavers, fathering children that they are not claiming with their enslaved people. So because your status is determined by your mother, Ellen was an enslaved person, despite the fact that she could have easily passed for a white person just by the color of her skin. However, Ellen decides that they're going to use this to their advantage. Because she can pass for a white person, she devises this plan where she dresses up as a sick white gentleman. Her story is that she's traveling north for medical attention, and her husband, William, is going to pretend to be her slave. So Ellen, as an enslaved person, was actually not used to looking white people in the face, just kind of out of a mark of respect. So she actually has William purchase green glasses that she wears during the entire journey. And her story is that she's traveling for medical attention. The other thing she does is that she puts her right arm in a sling. And that's because Ellen is illiterate. And in the 1800s, everyone is taught to read and to write with their right hand. You can't be left-handed. So by putting her right arm in that sling, she's removing the possibility that she's going to have to sign anything and therefore she's removing the possibility that she reveals her disguise by being illiterate. So the Crafts very boldly purchased passage up to Philadelphia in 1848 on trains and steamboats. And they make it to freedom in Philadelphia on Christmas Eve, 1848. I'm sorry, Christmas Day, 1848. Now, the Crafts have a hugely inspirational story. So they get to Philadelphia, they stay at their first safe house, they get their first reading lesson, and eventually they make their way up to Boston. And because their story is so inspirational, they start lecturing about it. It's recorded in abolitionist newspapers, and eventually it makes its way back down to their former enslaver in Georgia. Now, what's important to know is that in 1850, something called the Federal Fugitive Slave Law is passed. And the Federal Fugitive Slave Law says that even if you have escaped from enslavement and you live in a free state, you're not technically free. The person who once enslaved you has the legal and the federal right to send slave catchers, who are federal marshals, up to the state they think you are in with a written description of who you are and with a warrant for your arrest. More than that, you can be deputized as a citizen to help a slave catcher find someone. If you refuse, you can be put in jail for 6 months and fined $1,000. $1,000 in 1848 is roughly $28,000 to $30,000 today. So that is not an insubstantial amount of money. However, for people like Lewis and Harriet Hayden, this really becomes their finest hour because they are completely unwilling to compromise and to give in to this pressure. They continue operating their home as a safe house, and when word arrives that slave catchers are looking for the Crafts in Boston, Lewis and Harriet Hayden actually barricade themselves in their house with the Crafts. And when the slave catchers come pounding on the door demanding that Lewis Hayden hand over the Crafts, he answers the door with a loaded shotgun and a lit candle. And he says to the slave catchers, if you try and arrest anyone, I'm going to drop this candle. And then he opens the door a little wider, and he shows them that he has kegs of gunpowder in his living room. So Lewis and Harriet Hayden were willing to give their lives to protect two people from going back into enslavement. That is how strongly they feel about the institution of slavery, that they are literally willing to give their lives at a moment's notice. Now, for the slave catchers, this is a job. They're not willing to die in pursuit of two people. It's just not worth it to them. So they actually make a really hasty retreat from Boston. In their haste to leave the city, they actually run a toll, they forget to pay it, and this community has them arrested for that and thrown in jail. So a really good mark of how vigilant this community is. Now the Crafts, they realize that Boston and this country is no longer a safe place for them. They actually move to England. They raise a family there. They write their memoirs. Their book is called Running 1,000 Miles to Freedom. It's a hugely compelling narrative of their escape that I really encourage anyone to read. And then once slavery has been abolished in the United States and the Civil War has ended, they move back to Macon, Georgia. And in Macon, they open a school for the Black children in their community. So they really do come full circle and have a happy ending. Here's what I want you to kind of think about in relation to Underground Railroad activity in Boston. There are thousands and thousands of people that pass through Boston or come to Boston as freedom seekers before 1865. Now, of those thousands of people, we only know of a handful of people that are recaptured. One of them is a man named Shadrach Minkins. He's immediately rescued. One of them is a man named Anthony Burns. Although he's returned to enslavement, he is purchased 6 months later by this community, so he becomes a free man. Another is a man named Thomas Sims. He is returned to enslavement, but escapes again during the Civil War. So he is also a free man. We don't have a record of a person coming to Boston as a freedom seeker, being recaptured and lost to the institution of slavery. It just doesn't exist. I think that kind of statistic speaks incredibly well of the people in this community, of their determination, and of their willingness really to sacrifice their own safety to help other freedom seekers who are entering their community. Okay. Do we have any questions about the Underground Railroad in Boston, the Fugitive Slave Law, or any of those freedom seekers we just talked about?
Amelia, I have a question. I think it's the first time I've heard you talk about Ellen Craft's glasses, did you say they were green glasses, or did I misunderstand something you were saying there? Is that significant?
Yeah, they were green glasses, and the idea was just that the color of the lens would provide kind of enough disguise that she would look a little eccentric, and not have to look someone directly in the eye. Just kind of enough to remove a bit of that fear.
Interesting.
Yeah. The other thing that's really interesting about the Crafts escape is that from when Ellen and William devised the plan to when they actually escape is only about 8 days. So they make up their minds and act on this really quickly. They choose to escape around Christmas because historically people were given a little bit of time off during that holiday period, which meant that they were going to have a day or two before their enslaver would know that they were missing.
Thank you.
All right. All right, so we're going to shift now and talk a little bit about some of the geography of this community and how that helped them to be so successful as a piece of the Underground Railroad. So this is a map of Smith Court. This is Smith Court right in here from 1857. At the top of your map, you see Cambridge Street. This street right here is Joy Street. Also, it's Belknap Street at one point. And then we have South Russell Street over here. So the African Meeting House, which is going to be our last stop, is actually located right in the middle of this block in Smith Court. But what I want to point out to you is this little alleyway here. If you look really closely, you can see that the name Holmes is written down here. It goes all the way from the top of South Russell Street down to Cambridge Street. And it's actually really unusual to find Holmes Alleyway on a map. I went through a lot of 1850s maps to find this image of Holmes Alleyway. And that's because it's a neighborhood shortcut. We don't typically mark neighborhood shortcuts on maps now. We didn't back then, but it becomes a really critical piece of the Underground Railroad because of that. So if you were standing on Beacon Hill today, the entrance to Holmes Alleyway would look just like a narrow, dark alley with brick around it. It doesn't look hugely inviting. Today there's a light in it, but there was no light back there in the 1850s. And it is really just there to keep people from walking all the way up a hill to walk down the other side of another, because Beacon Hill is a large hill. So these used to exist all over Beacon Hill. A lot of them have been filled in. They're privately owned. Holmes Alleyway is a public access alleyway, which is why it has survived. And we think it's named for a woman named Isabella Holmes, who actually had a house back here that is documented as an Underground Railroad site. We have records of her hosting over a dozen people in her home in 1850, freedom seekers. So the story is that she used to leave her door open at night for anyone who might need a place of refuge. Now, because it's a neighborhood shortcut and it's not marked on any maps, the people who live on Beacon Hill know where Holmes Alleyway is. They're going to tell anyone they're harboring in their home about it. However, slave catchers coming into this community do not. They're working off of a map. The chances that they're working off of a map that include Holmes Alleyway are pretty slim. So if you are pursuing a freedom seeker and they run down an alleyway like this, you don't know where it leads. It's dark, it's narrow. You know that it is located in the heart of an abolitionist community. So you might be running into just that freedom seeker. You might be running into an angry abolitionist mob. So because of that, these alleyways become really critical to the Underground Railroad, and they often help to kind of separate freedom seekers from slave catchers. They're really allowing freedom seekers to move a little bit more efficiently and covertly around Beacon Hill and Boston. So I love to just point Holmes Alleyway out as one of those very physical reminders of the Underground Railroad that's survived even till today. Now, Smith Court, this is what it looks like in 1925, looks almost the same as it would have in 1850 or so. Smith Court is really kind of the hub of this free Black community in Boston. So the building you see right here is that Abiel Smith School. Holmes Alleyway comes out about here. And then this building here is the African Meeting House. So you really have a lot of pieces of significance in this community all crammed into one little street. So in relation to Smith Court, I want to talk about the story of a woman named Nancy Prince. She's actually born in 1799 in Newburyport, Massachusetts. She's born a free woman, but she is both of Native American and African descent. There is a long legacy of enslavement and escape in her family. So Nancy Prince is really well acquainted with the horrors of slavery and with the power of emancipating yourself from enslavement. She comes to Boston in the early 1830s. And then she moves to Russia for a while with a man named Nero Prince that she marries. After she is widowed, she comes back to Beacon Hill, quickly becomes a piece of that community again. She's actually baptized in the African Meeting House, and she becomes an important contributor to the Underground Railroad. So on a morning in 1847, around 11 or 12 o'clock, specifically a time when most of the men in the community would have been out at work, there's a commotion on Smith Court. And a bunch of neighborhood children come running down to Nancy Prince's house, and they inform her that there is a slave catcher at Mrs. Dorsey's home. Now, Mrs. Dorsey was a woman known to have escaped from enslavement at some point. So Nancy Prince quickly rallies the women from her neighborhood, and she goes down to Mrs. Dorsey's house. And I have a great quote I want to share with you. It reads, "Only for an instant did the fiery eyes of Mrs. Prince rest upon the form of the villain. For in the next moment she had grappled with him, and before he could fully recognize his position, she, with the help of the colored women that had accompanied her, had dragged him to the door and thrust him out of the house." Think about that. Nancy Prince is getting in a physical fight with a slave catcher in order to protect her neighbor, Mrs. Dorsey. She throws him out of Mrs. Dorsey's house, protecting Mrs. Dorsey from being recaptured and sent back into enslavement. The women actually chase him out of the north slope of Beacon Hill. They're throwing rocks at him. They're shouting insults. They chase him out of their entire community. He is so shocked by what happens that he does not return to Boston until after 1850, until after he has that backing of the federal fugitive slave law in order to recapture people. So I love to tell this story because I think it's a really great example of the power of women in this community. And then it just really emphasizes again how willing this community was to risk their own safety to protect those in their community. And I want to just close with the African Meeting House, which we saw already in that picture. This is the sanctuary. The African Meeting House really is the heart and the soul of this community. It is built in 1806 by this community. They raise their own time. They dedicate their own, they raise their own money. They dedicate their own time and labor to this building. And it's dedicated with about 40 members in December of 1806. It is today the oldest still standing Black church in the country. And it was the first Black church built north of the Mason-Dixon line. So it's a really significant structure. Now this community builds this church because they are really tired of being forced to go to white churches where they have to sit either up in the galleries or in the back of the church, and where they don't have the right to vote or participate in a lot of the social events. It's important to realize that religion plays a larger role in the 19th century in people's lives than it does today. It's not just an hour on Sunday. This is where you're coming to meet people, to socialize. It's part of your political life. So if you're facing discrimination in your religious life in the 19th century, it's truly having an impact on many other areas of your life. So the African Meeting House, it's built to be a multifunctional structure. So this community builds it as a place of worship, but also as a place where they can meet to discuss the Underground Railroad, to advocate for the end of enslavement, for the abolition of slavery. This is where they're coming to organize, to protest, to meet, to educate, and to worship. So it really does become the center of that community. Now, if you look at the floors in this image, those are actually the original floors from when the African Meeting House was built. If you walk on them, if you ever have the chance to visit this space, and I hope that you do, you truly can feel kind of the power of the people who've come before you in that space. This is one of the recruitment centers for the Massachusetts 54th Regiment. When you think about really big abolitionist speakers and leaders, they've spoken here, they've come here, people like Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, Maria Stewart, certainly the Haydens, William Cooper Nell. This really is the hub of the abolitionist movement in Boston. One of my colleagues, he likes to say that if Faneuil Hall is the cradle of liberty, is this then not the cradle of equality? And I truly don't think there's a better way to put it, because so much of that fight for equality and freedom is coming from this community on the north slope of Beacon Hill. Many of the times that they're meeting to discuss how they accomplish that or advocate for that, they're coming here to the African Meeting House to do that. And what they accomplish and what they advocate for, it doesn't just affect their community or Boston or Massachusetts, it has an impact on the United States as a whole. Does anybody have any questions about anything we've talked about?
Does Martin Luther King get involved in any of this during his period in Boston?
That's a great question. The African Meeting House is actually owned by a Jewish community during most of the 20th century. So the free Black community migrates out of this portion of Beacon Hill around 1900. And the meeting house is sold to an incoming Jewish immigrant community. So this is not a historic space, nor is it the African Meeting House itself during Martin Luther King Jr.'s time. However, as we know, he did study at Boston University, and his advisor actually had really close ties to this institution and to the museum.
Cool. Looks like Debbie Abbott has a question.
Well, it's not really a question.
Debbie Abbott, I think your microphone cut out.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay. This month on Channel 2, there is a great two-part series on the Black Church. And one of the, I don't know how many people might have caught it, but the first episode was on this week. And Skip Gates Henry Louis Gates is doing this wonderful series. And he was at the African Meeting House in part 1 of the series, and spends a lot of time and doing some interviews with people at that church.
That's awesome. I did not know about that. That's very cool.
Yep.
Cool. All right. It looks like Kathy McDonough has another question.
Yeah, I have a question about the sites. Are they any of these sites public sites, the places that you visited with us today, or are they all still in private hands and obviously then not open for public visitation?
That's a great question. It is a mix. So the Robert Gould Shaw Memorial is just, out on the edge of Boston Common. Anyone can visit at any time. It is currently being restored right now, though. So the memorial itself is not, it's not there. So don't go looking for it today. Most of the sites we visited are privately owned residences. A lot of them do have plaques or markers denoting them as a historic site. The exception is the Abiel School, which today houses the Museum of African American History, and the African Meeting House, which is owned by the Museum of African American History. In normal non-pandemic times, both of these sites are open to the public Monday through Saturday, but they are closed right now because of the pandemic and safety and health concerns. But post-pandemic, please come visit us in Boston and come see the African Meeting House and the museum. They're absolutely worth your time.
Thank you.
As a side note as well, I'm not sure how many people are aware that the Boston branch of the Museum of African American History has a partner on Nantucket, and they have a meeting house there as well. And both are affiliated, and they run virtual programs together. So if you're interested in finding out more about them, there's a whole website that will tell you all about their particular goings on as well.
I have another question about Boston's reputation. In the sports teams, Major League Baseball, I believe the Red Sox were the last team to have a Black person. Pumpsie Green was a pitcher. The Boston Bruins have a Black skater who's just recently retired, and they oppositely seem to have been ahead of the practice. The Celtics have Bill Russell, who is renowned as one of the greatest stars. So from your point of view, and I respect your knowledge of history, how does Boston get this? Some say it's very good and some say it's very bad, with our own history of fairness to Black people.
This is a great question. I actually spent a very long time last week discussing this with one of my colleagues. So let me see if I can sum it up quickly for you. Boston has a long history of being racist. We see a lot of that exemplified in sports, such as with the Red Sox refusing to put a Black person on their team. I think what we have to understand, though, is that the United States as a whole has a tendency to view Boston as a very liberal and progressive city. So because of that, I think often the standards for how we expect Black people to be treated historically and presently in Boston are set higher than they might be set in another city, and that we analyze them with a bit more scrutiny. When you look at kind of the statistics of, so the Spotlight team did a fantastic job looking into this. And when you look at the statistics of like how Black players are accepted in Boston versus in other cities, you see instances of really racist slurs and insults being used against Black people in a lot of cities across the country. You do see a slightly higher instance in Boston. I'm not a statistician, but I do think a lot of what we see in Boston is we expect to be in practice much more liberal and progressive and equal than we might actually be. And we expect that because Boston has this legacy of advocating for the abolition of slavery. We also have terrible images in everyone's mind when we think about busing in Boston. A lot of those images of Black children being bused to white neighborhoods and having rocks thrown at them, those really have stuck with people, as they should. We did not handle busing well in this city, but that's not to say really that most cities handled it well. So I think a lot of what we have going on is Boston continues to have a lot of attention thrust on it in terms of how they are perceived as a racist city, or as a city that has not yet achieved equality. I don't think any city really has achieved equality for everyone at this point. I think there is work to be done in every city. I think a lot of what we see, though, in Boston is we see a slightly higher level of scrutiny, which can be great because then we're way more aware of where the shortcomings are and what we need to improve on. But I don't, from what I know about the history of Boston and how change has been enacted here over the past 2 centuries, I don't think Boston's an outlier in that sense. I think that is kind of a universal problem throughout the United States.
Amelia, thank you very much. One last question. What organization do you represent?
I work for the National Park Service, and specifically I work for the National Parks of Boston. So that includes the Boston Harbor Islands, Boston National, which is the Freedom Trail, and Boston African American, which is the Black Heritage Trail, which is what you all visited today.
Well, you're a lovely lady and you know your history.
Thank you.
That she does. Any other questions for Amelia at this time?
I have a quick question. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, okay. So I read recently that there used to be a Great Island Tavern out, across Wellfleet Bay, and if there was some smuggling of slaves going on through there. And I wondered if you all know, was that part of, where were they going then? Were they going on to Boston, or were they going down to Bristol, or does anyone know how that fits in?
Yeah, so this is actually a really interesting question. We've learned in the last couple of years, largely through one of my colleagues who's been really interested in this, that a majority of the people who arrive in Boston as freedom seekers, they're actually coming by ship. So if we think of where Boston is located in terms of places that still have slavery around 1850, Virginia, Maryland, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, those are really far away to reach on foot or overland. So a lot of people who come to Boston as a freedom seeker are stowing away on ships. And then when they get to Boston Harbor or to a northern harbor in general, they might be jumping overboard. They're enlisting the help of communities that have abolitionists within them in those cities. We have accounts of people jumping overboard on ships in Boston Harbor in the winter and trying to swim to one of the islands. We have a captain named Austin Bierce who was notorious for piloting a small schooner around Boston Harbor. And when this community got word that there was a stowaway on a ship, he would go out to these ships, often bringing along a Black woman with fruits and pies. And the Black woman would go on board under the guise of offering fresh fruit and pies to these people who'd been on ships with no fresh fruit or food for weeks at times. And because she was Black, she would be able to kind of connect with the correct people to understand if there was a freedom seeker on board or not. And then once they determined that, the community was able to act really quickly to get that person off board, to disguise them, to hide them somewhere in Boston. A lot of people who come as a stowaway on a ship to Boston, they're coming to stay in Boston. It's technically a free city. There's a really vibrant, powerful free Black community here. So you can live here in relative safety. But a lot of people don't feel that that is the kind of security they're looking for, that that's enough. So they're coming into Boston and then they're having someone help them purchase passage on a train or a carriage up to Canada, which is kind of seen as the ultimate place of freedom. So it's a real mix, but the Maritime Underground Railroad, as we refer to it, is really vibrant and it's really strongly connected to places like Boston, Rhode Island, Connecticut, where you do have those abolitionist communities, but you're located further away from the South.
Interesting. Does that answer your question, Nancy?
It does. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions for Amelia right now?
Thank you for putting this on. Very nice.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Amelia. And I was wondering if you might be willing to say maybe just a little bit. I know you guys have some other like pre-recorded content available on your website. I was wondering if you might want to say a little about that and maybe your other upcoming offerings or anything like that.
Sure. So I would really encourage everyone to check out our websites. If you just Google the National Park Service in Boston, you should see links to Boston National Historical Park and Boston African American. You'll find a real wealth of resources on both of those sites. We have a series specifically about the Maritime Underground Railroad. We've had a lot of time during COVID to update our articles. So there's a lot of new articles and updated articles. And then we also have something called the Underground Railroad Hub. And that's got a really interactive map of all the Underground Railroad sites in Boston. There are story maps about specific freedom seekers that kind of detail their journey to freedom. And then a bunch of different articles and people with biographies. So feel free to check out the websites. We have an ongoing series through the end of April, I believe, with the Boston Public Library, where we're exploring different topics. So we have everything from like very specific to our site to like Bunker Hill and men of color who fought at Bunker Hill. There's a real wealth of different virtual programs with the Boston Public Library that are also free to register for. So check those out as well.
Great. Thank you very much. All right. Well, I hope you all join me in thanking Amelia so much for coming today and giving this wonderful presentation. Amelia has a wealth of knowledge, so if you guys think of more questions after this, I'd be happy to, connect you with Amelia for more information about that. So thank you very much. If I didn't mention it earlier,
Thank you.
this,
Thank you.
is a recorded
Thank you,
presentation,
Amelia.
so we'll have that available after. All right. Thank you so much.
You were
and-
Thank you
Terrific.
both. That was terrific.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you,
Thank
Melanie.
you, Mel.
Oh, you're
For
welcome.
pulling it together.
Well done.
Everybody have a safe, warm, and happy weekend.
You
Thank
too.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.